has been at the same number for the last couple of minutes. So I think most people that are going to be joining us are here. So this tour is kind of an interesting tour because it's really of two parts. Before we get started, I want to kind of introduce where we are and kind of where you all are right now. So Bound & Company is part of the South Street Seaport Museum. The museum is a really interesting collection of 19th century buildings, historic sailing vessels, and a large collection of artifacts that represent kind of New York's early history and the rise of the port city of New York. It's a really interesting place that kind of is nestled between the Brooklyn Bridge and the financial district in Lower Manhattan. And Bound specifically is a 19th century printing shop. And what that means for us is that we get our start from a shop that was founded in 1775, Bound & Company. Their original shop was actually just across the street from where I'm sitting now at number 39 Queen Street. And they were active in the neighborhood up until 1968, until they moved kind of with a lot of larger printing offices to Hudson and Varick Streets. And if we think about kind of the history of printing in Lower Manhattan, it's really kind of two parallel stories. When often people think of letterpress printing, they think of, you know, the Gutenberg Bible, or they think of newspapers or kind of book production. And that's one history that we like to talk about. But the other history that we like to talk about is something called job printing. Job printing is effectively anything that's not a book or a newspaper. So what kinds of things might that be? In the Seaport, you had a lot of kind of businesses that were set up to do trade all over the world, right? They were shipping tea and coffee or cotton, you know, from ports all over the world. So whenever you have that kind of commerce, you have things like receipts, you have things like invoices, you have advertising, you have labels. Those are things that you would produce at a job printing shop. And we kind of get to the word job printing from this ability to go into a shop and place a job, right? So Bound & Company started as a stationery printer. They printed letterheads and writing paper, but very quickly got into the idea of printing stationery. So they printed, you know, invoices and stock certificates, but they also printed advertising and small booklets. And we get to this idea of what kinds of things were printed here in the Seaport, right? And these are these individual kind of one-piece items that would have been either passed out or used in a business to kind of promote their products or advertise a new good or record a sale. So very quickly, we get to this kind of smorgasbord of printed material. And that's really only one thing that we're talking about today. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit to thinking about how printing shops and kind of printing offices really helped define the visual atmosphere of a city through how you get letters onto buildings. So I'm going to do that through kind of taking you around the neighborhood. And I wish that you could all be here with me walking around the neighborhood today, beside it being a little rainy and cold. It's an interesting kind of be able to walk around the neighborhood, but we're in a little bit of different times. And actually, I walked around a bunch a couple weeks ago, and because of all this outdoor dining that's happening, it's actually really hard to see things. So we're going to have a pre-recorded video that we're going to play in here in a second that kind of walks you around the district and talks about the different ways in which letters would have been put onto buildings. So I'm going to kind of hand it over to Ken right now, who's going to play that video that really talks about the techniques that these kind of designers would have used to brand a building for a business. So Ken, do you want to take over? All right, so we should get started. And we're going to start actually on Water Street, looking at the storefront of Bound & Company stationers. So Bound & Company is the 19th century printing office here at the South Street Seaport Museum, and is a row of buildings that takes up 211 to 207 Water Street. Then that building was built in 1839 in a configuration that's known as a counting house. And this kind of configuration of buildings is really important, especially in the Seaport, because it allowed businesses to integrate all aspects of their business vertically. So if we start looking at Bound & Company stationers, the first floor is a storefront. Your second, third, and fourth floor would have been warehousing space, and your top floor would have been, say, for accounting, right? So as you go up, that top floor windows become a little bit shorter. You don't need to build as robust of a building to hold people as you do warehousing. 211 Water Street historically has operated as a cast iron stove warehouse. So you would have kind of had a showroom of stoves and then 2 or 3 floors of stoves. Each stove could have weighed 200 to 400 pounds, right? And I like starting on Water Street when giving this type tour because it contains most of the kind of examples of how you would put your name or how you would kind of decorate a building. Unfortunately, all of the examples on this building are not historic, right? They're kind of historic from the 1960s as recreations, but it's a good place to start. So if we're thinking about how do we add our name of our building or our address or kind of what we do in this location to our building, we have really 3 options. So we're going to talk about the first 2 with this building. The first one being just painting right onto the side of the building. This is a pretty good way of doing it. It's relatively permanent. You can get a lot of visual impact. The way that these are painted are a little bit anachronistic, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. And then the second way is by hanging a sign. Signs would have been made in 2 different ways, either by carving them out of wood or painting onto wood or metal, which could then be hung on top of a building. This was a little bit more ephemeral, right? It means that you could move around a little bit, and as businesses changed, it was really easy to just hang a new sign. And that becomes really important as we kind of talk about the history of how businesses kind of came and went within this neighborhood. But without further ado, I'm going to take us, and we're going to walk down Water Street to Fulton. And we're going to look at kind of the museum's main building, right? So if we're looking at Water Street's a really interesting street because it's really the beginning of the Seaport district now, and was called Water Street because this is actually where the East River used to kind of end, right? So everything that we're going to be walking on as we kind of pass Water Street is now landfill. And that becomes pretty important as we look at some of the kind of unique characteristics of the buildings that we're looking at. This building here on the corner is Schermerhorn Row. This is the museum's main building. Is also built as a series of counting houses and was built in 1813, so it's a little bit older than the Bound and Company buildings. So here we are looking at Schermerhorn Row, and there's a couple distinct parts of this building that I want to point out. So one, you can see that it's actually devoid of signage, and I promise we'll get to that in just a little bit. But we want to talk back about that kind of counting house mentality, right? That you would have one business that could be vertically integrated upstairs. And if you look at Schermerhorn Row, right, we see that it's kind of divided into storefronts. And it looks like one continuous building, right? But it is all a bunch of individual storefronts. So if we look here, we see every 2 sets of windows and then a larger space and then 2 sets of windows. This would have meant that each little kind of unit of the building would have had a first floor retail, a couple floors of warehousing space, and then a top floor for accounting. You know, we can even see that here with those kind of top windows there. And if we're looking at how these buildings are constructed, they always have this kind of slab of concrete above the door. And that was a really great place to put your name, right? And if we see how we are doing that now, it's a little bit different than how we actually looked at it in the 19th century, right? If we look at the South Street Seaport Museum's name, you know, it's just painted right onto that brick. That's actually relatively anachronistic because what you would do is oftentimes you weren't the first person going into a building, right? You might be the second person or the third business to kind of take that space. So it's much more common to paint over the sign that you already see with a solid color. And we're going to see an example of that in just a second. And I'm going to take 1 second to look at the third option of how we can actually put our name onto a building, which is just behind me. So I'm going to cross the street really quickly and look up towards the Fulton Market. So the last way that you can really get your name onto a building is by integrating it into architectural elements. Here we see a really good example of what we would call V-chisel lettering. This technology of kind of using a chisel to cut letters out of stone comes to us from, you know, as far back as the Roman times, but it's a relatively rare thing that we see in the Seaport because it was really reserved for civic buildings or buildings that were built by a very famous architect or buildings that had like a really distinct name, like this Fulton Market building. Right? If you were a building that was just built to house a bunch of different businesses, typically what you would do is save it for signage or painting on the building, because those businesses would change over time, right? If you carve something right into the face of a building, it's relatively hard to change the name. So this is really the only example of integrated architectural lettering that we see, except for on occasionally we'll see the address of the building as numbers kind of right at the top as we start getting to cast iron architecture. So we're going to move on. We're going to walk down Front Street towards Beekman, which we'll start to see our first examples of some historic lettering. So we're going to take a quick stop here at the entrance to Cannon's Walk. If you haven't been in Cannon's Walk before, Cannon's Walk is actually a little alcove that comes behind the printing shop and acts as kind of like a breezeway to give a little bit of light and a little bit more air to those buildings. This would have been a really big building that kind of took up a whole city block, and by creating that little walkway, it gives you a little bit more air. And here we see kind of, again, two examples. I promise we're going to get to historic samples in a second. These are, again, from the kind of 1960s when the museum started renovating these spaces, and we see two really good examples, again, of one, a sign that's kind of painted and hung onto the surface of a building. That's relatively traditional. And then we see something that's actually pretty non-traditional, right? This Cannon's Walk sign of cutout letters that are then attached to a building. This is something that you wouldn't have seen in the 19th century, right? It either would have been carved onto a piece that was then architecturally kind of significant to the building, or would have been a sign that was kind of painted or carved, right? We don't necessarily see these kind of sculptural letters that were then affixed to a building. That's something that is not necessarily seen in the 19th century. So what did it look like in the 19th century? If we keep walking down to Beekman Street, we're going to see probably the best preserved option of a 19th century signage, and that's on the Fresh Salt building. So let's get there in just a second. Awesome. So now we're looking at Fresh Salt, or what was the Meyer Salt Company. And this is the best preserved example of late 19th century, early 20th century sign painting that we see in the Seaport. And there's a couple distinct kind of design methodologies that they're using here, right? So one of the first things is that they're taking up the whole space of their building, right? They're not kind of just making a sign that's really lovingly put in the middle that we would kind of think of today as kind of using a minimal amount of space, but they're saying, our building is this wide, so our signage needs to be this wide. That allows them to make as much visual impact as possible. We also don't see letters just kind of painted right onto the side of a building, but painted onto a background. Again, this is because oftentimes in this neighborhood, businesses would change relatively quickly. So instead of just painting your name right onto the brick and then having to kind of scrub that off and paint over it, you would just paint a white background or a black background to kind of cover up that business that was there, which you could then paint your name on top of. You also see that a lot of it is painted in black and white. If we think about pigments that were available in the kind of late 19th century, black and white were really typically popular. Another color that you see is red, right? And this is because pigments were available, they were cheap, and that they're relatively stable, right? If we look up to the way very, very top where it would have said the Meyer Salt Company, you can see that that is the most deteriorated, and then you see fresh salt and smoked fish become a little bit more stable, and then as you go down it's even more stable. The kind of urban legend here is that they would store the salt on the top floor, and then every day when it was kind of time to kind of clean up for the day, they'd wash it with water. And that water and that salt water would kind of get into the brick, which wouldn't let the paint really stick to it. We also start to see letters kind of deteriorating at different rates, right? Some of the black has fallen off, where some of the white is still staying true. Oftentimes, white was made with lead oxide as a paint pigment. That lead oxide is relatively stable, which means it's not going to degrade as fast as your carbon-based paints, which are made out of black. If we look just one more down, and I'm just going to step into the street for a second, we'll see this kind of Joseph A. LaRocca Shellfish Company. That's a recreation, but it's done in probably the most historically significant or more historically congruent way, again, by painting that solid color and then painting your letters on top of it. Also using a color like dark blue allows you to get that contrast that you're seeing in that kind of black and white, so you can really see this from afar, right? Your signage was about getting your building seen and getting it known, when everything else had a lot of signage, you wanted as much contrast as possible. So moving on from Fresh Salt, we're going to keep going down Front Street. And Front Street has some little bits of signage that are kind of important for us to look at. The first one we're going to come to is to the only surviving example of kind of a wooden carved sign, which is actually relatively typical in a Seaport district. So if we look across the street to this restaurant called El Brigante, we start to see this kind of carved wooden sign. This sign was actually carved by the State Museum volunteer Sal Polizzi. So carved in the 1980s, but done in a 19th century style. If we look at this sign, again, it's this kind of V-carved chisel carving, and would have been really good for a business that maybe wasn't staying around for a long time, or was maybe a restaurant that was kind of moving from place to place. This would have made moving relatively easy, as you just take your sign down and then hang it up when you're ready to kind of open up shop again. This kind of wooden carved signage is really typical of a lot of maritime neighborhoods, because a lot of things like running boards and the way that you put your name on ships use this same technology. Moving even further down Front Street, we have a lot of examples of kind of recreated signage, right? So if we're looking at this Jack's Coffee as we're walking, you know, that is kind of painted right on the pediment as well. But they all kind of don't follow that tradition of, you know, painting a solid color and then your letters on top of it. The next example we're going to talk about is the Knickerbocker Ice Company. So that now is taken up by a company called Made Fresh Daily. And this is a particularly interesting sign because it doesn't follow a lot of kind of traditions of early 20th century, late 19th century painting, and that it's very obviously not made from a printed example, right? So everything else that we've seen so far, all of the letter forms are relatively well rendered. They're built off of kind of concrete typography, where this sign here, if we look at historic examples, pretty much kind of hand done. It is also kind of fading more considerably than a lot of the lettering that kind of survives in the neighborhood, and I think that has to do a lot with the pigment that was used, right? Yellow and kind of brighter colors, unless you're using heavy metals like cadmium, are relatively volatile, right? So they degrade a lot with the sun. So being able to see that kind of yellow really flaking off becomes a relatively difficult thing to see. Every time I give this tour, there's less and less of this sign, and we have to get questions about preservation, right? Can you stabilize it? Can you fix it? And any attempt to kind of stabilize it would effectively do more damage than it would saving it. So unfortunately, this one, you know, it probably only has another decade so of life before it's kind of completely gone. So we're still on Front Street, and I'm going to look at this kind of address at 229 Street. It's a particularly interesting example that shows this concept of kind of painting over each other. It's a little hard to see in this show, but I have some close-ups that we're going to kind of put on the screen that show that there's a lot of different signs kind of painted over top of each other here, right? The first one being this kind of red with white lettering that was then painted over with a white background with black lettering painted on top. This is also starting to kind of see the most popular typographic style that really dominated the last half of the 19th century, which is this use of Clarendon as a typeface, right? So Clarendon became kind of a simplified version of a serif typeface, often using kind of slab serifs that were much easier to paint, right? So if you think of things like Times New Roman, which are traditional serifs, right, as you get into those really soft details, it becomes really difficult to paint. That really heavy detail is not needed when we're looking at something from very far away. So these slab serif typefaces become really popular because they're easier to paint. Oftentimes you would look at a slab serif and they'd be the width of a paintbrush, right? And you would start to see, if we're looking at fresh salt and we're looking at kind of these other signage, you know, why wouldn't they just do it in kind of block lettering, or what we would and serif typography. And if we look at kind of historically in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, that sans serif typography just wasn't popular, right? You start to see a little bit kind of in the early 20th century, but serif typography has a 400-year history before you really started to even see sans serif typefaces, right? The first commercially available sans serif typeface wasn't designed until 1819, right? So you started to see this kind of Clarendon typography really take over the kind of signage industry, and we see that in a lot of historic images that we see, and this is a really good example. Both the kind of sign that has been painted over and the front sign of it are both kind of based on the same idea of Clarendon. So we're getting kind of close to the end of our tour, and we're going to turn around and kind of walk down Peck Slip and then go down Water Street, and we have two more kind of interesting examples. So now we're looking at kind of one really interesting piece of signage here. So this is a warehouse that was run by a company called Baker & Williams. Baker & Williams had a relatively large amount of warehouses throughout the city come the early 20th century. If we look at the sign again, it kind of fits in the same idea of kind of like a Clarendon-esque letters, but you can see that within that kind of family of Clarendon typefaces, there's a relatively large variety, right? This is a fairly extended, and that the letters are wider, right? A lot of times when you see kind of Clarendon set on posters, because it's a much more vertical format, you see them being much more condensed, right? Again, not to sound like a broken record, but if we look here, it's that kind of whole width of the building with a black painted background and white lettering, right? And you can see some of the white lettering has served a lot more well over the time than the black lettering has, right? Because of that same kind of lead oxide paint that we're seeing. We can see some really interesting aspects of this sign if we get really close, and that we see that at one point this was painted red, right? And it was painted wet red with white lettering on top of it. And some of that black kind of painting that's on top has degraded so much that we can start to see that kind of white lettering come out from it, right? So for a long time, I had difficulty kind of figuring out what this actually said. Not until we found some kind of historic images of it that we really said, okay, it's Baker and Williams. And this is that same idea that, you know, this is a relatively large warehouse. It wasn't necessarily built by one business, but what it was done is it was built and then sold to kind of, you know, whoever wanted to kind of rent it out. And then if that person decided to leave and then rent out to someone else, what would happen is they would just paint over the name that was painted on it and paint their name right onto it. It's a relatively common process, right? Is that kind of ephemeral nature of the Seaport district really becomes kind of seen by being able to see these signs painted one over top of each other. So we're kind of coming towards the end, and down Water Street we have our last version of kind of some signage that's seen in the district. It's kind of just across the street from Baker and Williams, and we start to see this 270 William Street. And 270 William Street is kind of an interesting one. Again, it kind of fits a lot of what we've been talking about for like the last couple signs that we looked at. It's based on a Clarendon, right? It has these kind of slab serifs with not a lot of detail. It's painted with white lettering, but then we have kind of brown as this color. Brown is an interesting color because it's not one of those typical kind of paints that we'd always see, but it is kind of an interesting one for this kind of facade, right? Part of me thinks that this actually started out as more of a reddish color, and that over time that kind of red has faded into brown. Again, we see this typical of taking up the whole surface of the building, the whole width, you know, kind of making the letters as large as you can so that you could see them from as far away as possible. There's also one little tiny detail. If we look right to this column, right, we see this kind of unpainted area. And I'm going to put a close-up on the screen of this now. And if you notice, it says canvas. Right? I think this is a really lovely way of kind of preserving something within this neighborhood of just not painting out this little square. And this sign is very, very, very faint, right? It's something that's very hard to look at, but when we see it, we can obviously see what it says, right? So if you think about what this building might have done, is it had to do something with canvas. Maybe it was a sailmaker's loft, maybe it was, you know, kind of a canvas wholesaler. And having that little kind of artifact of the 19th century becomes really important. So that's kind of the tour that we see in the Seaport. And what I'm going to transition to is kind of looking at some images of something that's a little bit further away from Lower Manhattan. So that's kind of the end of this video tour, and we're going to go back towards looking at a little bit of a presentation. Cool. So before we kind of do that, I'm going to actually give me. I can't see the Q&A, which is kind of frustrating. But there was a couple of really good questions. Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a second so that we can actually see this Q&A that I kind of want to address before we kind of move on. So Cassandra had a really good question about how much of the typography that we see in historic signage translates to typography that we see in a letterpress printing shop like Bound & Company that we have here. And what I would say is that there's a really, really large connection, because oftentimes the signage that you see on building comes directly from movable type. So there's a process called pouncing, where you would take a printed sample of wood type or metal type and expand it to a much larger size by kind of tracing it with a pantograph, which is this tool that's used for enlarging or reduction. And then once you had this kind of big paper template, you would poke a bunch of little tiny holes kind of around the perimeter of each letter. Those little tiny holes would allow you to use chalk to pass through those holes that would give you a template on the side of your building. So in a lot of these examples that we're looking at, all of them except the Knickerbocker Ice Company, you see that the letter forms are really, really well rendered. And that's not necessarily because the people who are painting the sides of buildings had, the perfect penmanship and were kind of constructing these letters. It's because they were working from templates, right? So printing shops like Bound and Company, these job printing shops that had a large collection of type, often would be kind of called upon to make templates, masters, and examples that would then be translated to kind of sign painters. Michelle Kennedy had a question of why some signs might be in serif typefaces. Serif typefaces are the ones with the little feet, versus sans serif are the ones without. And it actually kind of is based on age. So if you look at the Meyer Salt Company, the fresh salt signage, that's all primarily rendered in sans serif typography. And that shows that it's actually a little bit younger, right? It's right around kind of the turn of the 20th century. You often see serif typefaces in kind of older styles because serif typefaces actually predate sans serifs by a considerable while, right? The first kind of serif typefaces you see are actually based on ancient Roman carving. You don't see sans serif typefaces commercially available until the 1830s, right? So you have 500 or 600 years from the invention of printing that you see kind of Roman serif typefaces, and then a relatively small history of sans serif typefaces. I think the last one before we start going is kind of these questions about preservation of signage. Oftentimes the best thing you can do for signage that's painted onto a building is let it sit. As the paint starts to flake, your options for preservation become limited. So you can do things like stabilizing them with resins and things like that. That becomes relatively invasive. But even the task of kind of cleaning them, of dry brushing them, you often see more loss in the sign than you do what you kind of stabilize or preserve. So in some ways, kind of just leaving them to kind of be is the best way to preserve them. One last question before we go on. With the enlargement, would the weights and widths be pulled from a template or adjusted in the process of pouncing? The enlargement is a one-to-one process. So you would start with whatever typeface you had in the shop, whatever weight or width that you had, and that would become kind of your master template. The pouncing process is really just that act of transferring the chalk onto the masonry slab or the side of the building. Cool. So I'm just going to keep those clean. And I'm going to kind of leave Malcolm's question for a second. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, share my screen again. And we spent the most part of that kind of quick video talking about the really local area of the Seaport, right? Kind of the 19th century buildings that exist between the Brooklyn Bridge and the financial district that are really close to the water. And if we think about the larger history of printing in Lower Manhattan, we have to talk about newspapers, in particular about Printing House Square, or what was called Park Row. So in the kind of early part or the middle part of the 19th century, you started to see kind of the major players in New York newspapers start to kind of set up shop right along Broadway across from City Hall. So this image shows kind of the big players. On the right-hand side, we have the New York Times, and then we have the Sun, the Daybook, and the Tribune. And these buildings would kind of set up all of your major newspapers, right? And if we ask the question, why would they all want to be next to each other? Why were they all being this part of the city? The answer is that you want to be where your business is. So very much like in the Seaport, where your job printers are where these businesses are that are kind of creating these goods and need records and sales. A newspaper is about recording the news and kind of getting the news out there. And a large part the news was happening in City Hall. So you wanted to be kind of where that action was. By the kind of early part of the 20th century, those buildings had become much larger, right? So if we look at kind of these two images together, this is the New York Times, that becomes this building here. This becomes the New York Globe building, which is at one time the largest building or the tallest building in New York City. And this is kind of where you start to see the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. Unfortunately, most of these buildings no longer exist. The Brooklyn Bridge kind of on-ramp construction in the early part of the 1950s kind of saw all of this row of buildings be torn down. The only one that kind of still exists today is 41 Park Row, which was the New York Times building. And to kind of round out our tour, there's just kind of a funny story about this New York Times building that I always get a kick out of. This is what it looks like today. It's owned and operated by Pace University. You can see also One Pace Plaza kind of takes the space of kind of these other big newspaper Goliaths that we see. But 41 Park Row didn't always look like this. At the initial building in 1857, 41 Park Row was only 5 stories tall. It looked like this. Here we see also kind of the same examples of what we were talking about, right? So this building was built specifically for the New York Times, so their name is architecturally integrated to the building. They didn't need the whole building kind of when they started, so they leased out some of the lower floors, so those got wooden signs, right? So this idea of permanence is really important when you're looking at why things look the way they do, and that carving your name into a building or architecturally affixing it to a building is the most permanent way. If you're only going to stay there for a couple years or a little bit, or you don't know when your rent is going to be up, making a wooden sign that you can kind of affix to a building gives you a little bit more flexibility. So if you move down the street or to another building, you can physically take your sign with you. But the interesting story behind this building is it was built in 1857, and it was at that time considered one of these buildings that was built specific for a business, right? The New York Times had this building designed and built for their printing operation, which was kind of unique at that time. Oftentimes buildings were just built and then you found the businesses to kind of rent them out and take up that space. So over the course of 30 or 40 years, the New York Times slowly took up more and more of the space until 1888. They decided that they needed more room. So what they did is they first decided that they really liked their address. They really liked 41 Park Row. They were right in the middle of Printing House Square, and that they didn't really want to move. So they came up with this idea of building a 12-story building around the 5-story building that they already owned. This was relatively experimental at the time, but there was one more stipulation, is that they couldn't stop printing. So they built this 12-story building around the printing facilities of this 5-story building, which were in the basement, and built that 12-story building, which opened in 1903. And that was originally had a mansard roof. And then in 1905, they decided they didn't like the mansard roof and they put 3 more stories on it. So right now it sits at 15 stories and looks like this, and is kind of the last surviving of the early kind of New York newspaper monolith buildings. It's a really interesting one. There's a lot of kind of urban legends about it. The printing press was actually in the 3rd level of basement. And when Pace University took it over, that became a gym, which had a swimming pool. I unfortunately can't get down there. I happen to teach at Pace University, so I actually teach in this building. And all of the lower floors are kind of off limits. But it's a really interesting kind of peek into history of these big kind of printing industries that really gave birth to kind of this idea of Lower Manhattan, right? Is that printing was such a unique part and such a large player in this neighborhood and in this district. So with that, I'm kind of done with my little part of the presentation. I'm open to taking more questions. I'd also like to thank you for joining us and point you to back to the museum. This program will be posted online if people that you were kind of wanting to join it want to kind of look at it at other times. We also have a whole bunch more programming that's posted online, kind of that we've done digitally during this kind of time where we can't actually welcome you to our spaces right now. We've been doing a lot of work on Instagram, kind of posting things from our archive and collection to share them with you all. And with that, I'm going to just kind of stop sharing my screen and look at some questions. So there's a question about, are there any signs that used to be there that have disappeared with age? Not completely disappeared since my time of being here. So I've been here at the museum for just over 5 years. And, I've seen things like the Knickerbocker Ice Company. I've seen more of it go away. But I haven't seen anything kind of completely disappear. One of the nice things that's kind of really interesting, though, is that as parts of this neighborhood are kind of cleaned up, is you actually start to see some things kind of reappear. And every time I kind of walk around, there's little bits and pieces that you don't notice. So while we specifically focused on kind of painted signage within this tour, there could be a whole other tour about molded cast iron lettering. One really treat is if you go to where the Paris Cafe kind of used to be at the corner of Peck Slip and South Street. All of the columns are very sculptural, and they have the names of the manufacturers kind of as typographic treatments along their base. They're super indicative of their age and of their time, and I think they're really, really beautiful. Let's see. Malcolm has a question about, aside from the type and typefaces and other elements of the designs of signs that date them, type is actually a really, really good way of dating things. It's probably the single best tool that we have. There are things like pigments, and you can get into kind of more kind of the chemistry behind it of actually looking at breaking down what the pigments are built out of. That's not something that we really have the capability of doing here. But I think if someone wanted to do like a really, really deep dive of kind of going that far, that's one way of dating it. And then also the museum's archive of photographs and images. As you can kind of see, if you have photos of the same building from year to year, that's a really good way of being able to see, okay, this changed. So having this kind of larger archive is super, super useful. Sure, I'm going to answer Cassandra's question. The answer to your question at the simplest is yes. But yes, we are an educational part of the Seaport Museum. We are a working print shop. Right now, because we can't bring people into our spaces, or we're not bringing people into our spaces at the moment, we're doing some digital programming like this. We're doing a lot of kind of digitization of our archive that, Instagram is a good way of doing that. The Seaport Museum has kind of a larger push to do that. There's a fantastic blog that has a lot of really good work from the collections team. But one of the things that we do that I think is very unique is that we use our collection to kind of do what it is intended to do. So the collection at Bound consists of 34 historic printing presses, the oldest one from the 1830s, the youngest from the 1970s, almost 2,000 drawers of movable type. And for the most part, a large portion of that falls into what we call the working collection that me and Christine, who's the other full-time printer here at Bound, can use to make things like wedding invitations or writing papers or restaurant menus. A lot of that is trying to kind of use the collection to preserve the skill of letterpress printing, of setting type by hand. So we work with a range of clients. You can get stuff printed from us. There is information about that on the South Street Seaport Museum's website. But really my role as an art director is to uh, keep this kind of shop active and working, right? So at times when we can share that with the public, we do that. And times that we're just using it to kind of print things that we can sell, we do that. So it's kind of a mixed bag. That's why I said the easy answer is yes. We do a lot of things. We love having kind of school groups come and visit us and show them how a range of kind of printing technologies works and kind of give a lot of context to why certain things look the way they do. Let's see. Um, Lauren has a question of, do we have any information about law copyist offices during the 19th century? Also, where one would have purchased paper. So the law copyist is not something that I can speak specifically to. It's not come up in kind of the research that I've done. I'm sure that the museum's kind of collection and archive has some information on it, but it's kind of, buried in records and books and things like that. So that could be something that we could kind of find out. But this idea of kind of where paper and writing materials kind of would have been purchased, Bound and Company is actually a good historical example of that. As a stationery store, they often kind of published what their stock lists were. The New York Public Library has the collection of a man named Ted Stanley, who was the CEO of Bound and Company through the late 1980s, and was one of the kind of primary players that brought Bound and Company to the South Street Seaport Museum when they were still a large commercial entity. And in those kind of collection of papers, he has stock lists from the 19th century, and Bound would sell plain paper and lined paper and ruled paper and paper that was both domestic and European. So stationery outfits like that served a really critical role with the kind of selling of that kind of material. So I'm going to answer Morgan's question first because I can actually show you something. So what are some of the most popular and beautiful things that were printed? I kind of glossed over it a little bit. So I'm going to share my screen again because I can actually show you an example of something. So the museum has a large collection of these things that we call clipper ship cards. And they're a really interesting kind of peek into the collection for a lot of reasons. So what they functioned was, these are about 5 by 7 inches in size. And they were handbill advertisements that would have been passed out to kind of local businesses advertising ships that were sailing from New York to San Francisco. Typically, they kind of had other routes, but one of the most popular was New York to San Francisco. And these ships would kind of just fill up with kind of goods and cargo, and then make their way down around South America, back up to California. They are really interesting. I mean, at least from my perspective, because it shows a lot of the change in kind of visual styles that you see in the middle of the 19th century. So a lot of the ones that are a little bit older are a little bit more plain, right? They're kind of just typed in 1 or 2 colors that are on straight lines. And then as kind of technology develops, you start seeing things like wood engraving. So this blue kind of background and this decorative type here would have been carved by hand out of a block of maple. As they kind of produce even more, you start seeing even more detailed, even more outlandish images. You start to see type. If we look at kind of this one from the Comet, it's back in here, that kind of is all kinds of crazy, bent in lines, and they have all these kind of filigree elements and different kind of borders. These clipper ship cards, while they kind of tell the story of advancement of technology and kind of visual trends at the time, it also speaks to kind of a specific maritime kind of trade. So I think it kind of hits all of the points at the museum as kind of a really interesting collection of objects. Um, I'm not sure exactly how many they have, but I know that we have like hundreds of them, right? So it's like you can kind of look at this kind of single collection of things and see how something morphs over time. I think that's really interesting, rather than looking at kind of one particular object for its like singular beauty, is like seeing them, kind of year over year. It also starts to get into questions of, as different technologies like lithography started to become more prominent and more commercially viable, you started seeing early photographs being reproduced in these kind of clipper cards too. So it's a really interesting peek into technology, but it was also a place where printers kind of uh, brought out all the tricks and trades, right? So they were really outlandish. They didn't need to be, right? They were ephemeral, so they were meant to kind of be used one time, and then once that trip was done, they were meant to be thrown away. Luckily, some people decided not to throw them away, and now we have them in the collection. Sure. So Lauren's question about the coin that we see, I'm going to answer that because it's a pretty simple one. I'm going to go back to this. So this is actually for the World's Fair of 1853. It was presented to Bown and Company for the production of ledger books. It was actually something that Bown and Company got relatively famous for, was a production of lined ledgers. So that's kind of what this coin was, is a gold medal for the work that they did in that World's Fair. I didn't share my screen. This question about kind of overpainting of previous signage, are there situations in the Seaport where there are multiple units combined into a larger space, and so multiple individual signs overpainted by a single extended width sign? It's not common. There are some kind of historical photographs where you do see like a really, really long sign. I think it all depends on kind of how those specific buildings were kind of built, and kind of how they were subdivided. So if you look at Skirmahorn Row, it's always kind of like two sets of windows. So you have two windows that are kind of close together, and then a large space for bricks, and then two windows that are close together. And if you kind of go into the interior structure of those buildings, you can kind of see how they would have been divided. So for those, it's kind of, you could see how each little subunit would have been a singular entity. And there might have been examples where a business kind of bled over between two of them. But I think what's more likely is that, buildings like Fresh Salt, or where you saw the La Rocca kind of oysters, the reproduction sign, those buildings just had a much kind of more expansive space. And the kind of typical tradition was just, kind of putting your arms out like this, right? It's like you're kind of taking as much space as you had, and just taking up that width. That was really, in thinking about the tradition of that kind of painting, something that you see time and time again. Daniela's question about what are the oldest things printed is a good question that doesn't have a super easy answer. So if we think of kind of printed from movable type in the Western world, we think of the Gutenberg Bible, right? So that was printed in the 1450s. There was printing way before that, but not necessarily from movable type as we know it today. There was movable type in Korea and in China that was made from either hand carved wood or from kind of shaped clay, that happened as far back as like the 800s. There was printing from carved wooden blocks. So I'm not actually sure what the oldest thing printed that we can point to today is. I'm sure that, we're kind of always discovering older examples of printing. And like some people would even say that, the kind of cave paintings in France were an element of printing. So kind of how you describe printing. But when we kind of think of letterpress printing in the Western world, we often kind of point to Johannes Gutenberg printing the kind of Gutenberg Bible in the 1450s. The John W. Campbell fresh fish lobster card is also a favorite of ours here at the museum. That's why it's probably in every presentation that I've given. All right. I'm going to do kind of one last pass for questions. If not, that kind of takes us up right into the hour. So if you don't have any more questions, thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I know that's something that happens with me a lot. Yeah, and I think that's it. I think that there might be something in the chat from Ken Summer. I actually can't see the chat anymore. There we go.